welcome back to another episode of Meet the Creatives. We are here today with Michael Bierut. Michael, before I begin, I just wanted to, first off, I want to thank you for coming on and
Rob, you're welcome.
spending time with me on a Monday at Pentagram.
Yeah.
Wow, that's awesome. Before I begin, I just wanted to share a quick story with you. When I first started this podcast, it was just, an impulse buy on Amazon. I was like, I'm going to buy a microphone, try something out creative, and this will be my, my side project. And I remember that John Mayer a few years back gave a speech about setting your expectations when you embark on a project and, you set out on to accomplish a goal. Where is the bar? And for me, when I did it, it sounded crazy at the time. I was like, well, you know what? I'll consider this a successful project if I can get Michael Bierut to come on. So yeah, and I'm not just saying that to appease you. I mean, my fiance would vouch for me on that. I was like, well, maybe one day, and she was like, he's never gonna come on. So this is very surreal, and I don't know where to go from here as far as guests. I might have to go around the Pentagram office. No, I'm just kidding. But thank you for being here, though. This really is an honor, and I'm very flattered that you would spend your busy time with me. So
it's my pleasure, Rob. Thanks.
Cool. All right, so let's get it started. At the AIGA Design Conference, you gave a speech entitled What I've Learned, and you talk about the trajectory of your career and what you've learned along the way. During the talk, you stated to hijack your mentors, and that was also another inspiration for this podcast, I should add. From that, that's how new this podcast is, that it's kind of from there. But you said you don't have to ask them permission, you hijack them. They don't need to know that they are your mentors, and you do not need to tell them that you are their protege. Can you explain how you came to this conclusion? Did you always have this, or was it something you discovered as your career went on?
I don't think I ever thought of it consciously, but I kind of decided really early on, when I was in college, that what I just found the most inspiring was being exposed to people whose work I admired and kind of coming to understand how it was they did that work, what their inspirations were, what their methodology was to develop the work, how they could persuade clients to, how they could find people to commission the work, how they could explain those clients to actually follow through with the work, how they made sure that it was good, how they just sort of like fought for excellence. And so that could be, I had professors at the University of Cincinnati like Gordon Salko and Joe Bottoni and Stan Broad and Ann Gorey Goodman and Heinz Schenker, who I really admired. I had internships that I did with Dan Bittman in Cincinnati and AIGA medalist Chris Pullman, then up at WGBH up in Boston. Then, of course, I took a job right out of school with Massimo Vignelli, with whom I worked for 10 years from the week after I graduated until just a little bit more than 10 years later. And I never said to any of those guys, would you be my mentor? I just sort of attached myself to them and sucked every ounce of information and inspiration and everything else I could out of them.
Right?
Like a mosquito, like a parasite or a leech.
There you go.
Yeah, exactly. And at the same time, I also learned that all around me were you could learn from everyone. Yeah, I mean, you could learn from anyone or anything. You could learn from a book. You could learn from a TV show. You could learn from a piece of music or a piece in a art gallery. You could learn from people your own age. You could learn from people that were younger than you. You could learn from people that were designers. You could learn from people that did something totally different. And so, to a certain degree, I think the conventional idea of mentor, then I came to understand, these guys were really my mentors, and they acted as my mentors. They would advocate for me. They would, give me opportunities that made me grow as a designer, and I'd say as a person, as a human being too. But I think that wasn't the starting point of the relationship. The relationship just was me really kind of being interested in and being inspired by them, and just being an inquisitive person who was both willing to learn And then I think in the long run, kind of you in turn have to be willing to teach and be a mentor yourself in a way, right? So I think I never thought about this that much until I would start getting inquiries, questions later on in life from people saying, how can I find a mentor? Would you be my mentor? And I mean, I never.
It's a lot to ask of someone.
Yeah, but people see the power of that sort of relationship, and I think they just decide, I'm going to be bold and go for it.
Right.
And I sort of like, I thought, well, that's a good way to do it, I suppose. But when I really thought about how I came to have these relationships myself, it had much less to do with kind of casting people in my mind as potential mentors, and more just to do with acting on my enthusiasm and passion I had for the professional field, specifically for different individuals and their work specifically, and just for the idea of design as a social activity that you do with other people. So I sort of started saying, look, you're making your first mistake by asking for permission. You don't even, yeah, just do it, and you don't, if you just sort of like see every relationship you have not as an opportunity for benefit or exploitation, but for teaching and learning, it ends up really being something that benefits everyone. So I swear to God, I learned just as much from the designers who work for me at Pentagram, obviously the partners I have here, a few of which are older than me, a lot of whom are younger than me, and just all over town, people that both do what I do something completely different, all over the world really, are people from whom I learn something or other. And, and sometimes I've been inspired by their writing, I've been inspired by their work, I've been inspired by their example, and I've never even met them. Every once in a while I'll sort of, a few months ago I met someone who wrote a book that really had inspired me, and I'd never met the person before, and it was just I felt like I knew them when I met them. And I think it's sort of alarming, actually, when that happens, because they're like,
it's happening right now to me.
No, but it's like, for them it was alarming. Just like, who are you again? I mean, it's sort of like, oh, I'm your biggest fan. So, so I think it's, but I mean, that's sort of, the world just presents all those opportunities, and I think it's a big mistake if you think that that relationship has to start with an application form and a sort of a formal agreement between you as a protege and your target as a mentor. I just think just be hungry and be curious and be enthusiastic and passionate, and it all just sort of comes together.
Right, that's awesome, and I've experienced that firsthand with this podcast, and it's been I think this is like the 7th episode or so, but it's really crazy because I've gotten. I used to kind of watch courses on lynda.com with Sean Adams, and I would think, wow, it'd be so cool to meet him. And then when you meet him, he's exactly that same person. Then by the end of it, you realize that that these people are very similar to the thing they are on the internet. So it's so cool though, and it's been so rewarding.
Yeah.
But it's
and by doing them as podcasts, you're actually. It's an act of generosity on your part because you're making these conversations available to the world, to people who aren't there, on the line when you're having the conversations or in the room when you're having the conversations. And I think it really is a way to, to magnify that individual benefit that you would get so that anyone can really partake of it, which I think is fantastic.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's really kind of neat because when I first started doing them, I would ask these questions that were kind of, your average interview questions, but when you have an hour to sit down with somebody like yourself, it's important to remember that people are listening, and I try now to ask the questions that I would if we were just sitting down at dinner and I had an hour to talk to you. So that's really cool.
Good.
Cool. I like that answer, by the way. That was like my next 2 questions were like in there, so that's good. I find myself endlessly sifting through books and portfolios of my favorite designers, trying, as everybody else does, to sort of crack the code of great design. And Sean Adams has told me about, ask Michael and he'll be able to tell you anything about design history and where that's from. And things of that nature. So you have kind of an encyclopedic knowledge of design. Where do you find inspiration? I mean, where do you, I know, because do you ever feel like you're kind of out of things to read, or is there always more?
No, not never. I have such a backlog of things to read. It really is. It's scary, and I'm actually at the age now where I'm kind of realizing that I may not have a long enough life to get through all the things that I want to read between now and then. Particularly because I sort of, unlike my younger days, I go to bed, I open a book, and I can I'm unconscious before I get to the bottom of the page. I used to be able to stay
25 and that happens, so don't feel bad. It's okay.
Yeah. Well, when I was a kid, I wasn't like that as much. So I get tons of inspiration from all over the place, and I also just I think there are different kinds of designers, particularly graphic designers. I think my old boss Massimo, I think used to. He was very big on saying design is one. If you can design one thing, you can design anything. And I think he really believed that, and he really lived that principle. And it took me a while to realize that I think that may be true for him, but it's not true for me. I'm a graphic designer. Right. And I'm a graphic designer not because I like type and PMS colors better than I like, architecture or product design or the materials you use for those other disciplines. But what I like about it is that it's about communication, and the subject matter you're communicating is usually something that's outside your own area of expertise, right? And so, part of, one of the things that I actually find inspiring is, I'm certainly inspired when I look at, the work of other designers, people that are, contemporaries or up and coming or long dead. You can learn stuff from all that stuff. But also just being in a situation where I'm meeting someone new and they have some sort of, they've decided they have some sort of problem that they think is requires some sort of solution that involves graphic design. And I just find that I just take advantage of that situation just to really satisfy my curiosity about what it is they do, what it is they're trying to achieve. I don't work that well with people.
My cat got in the way.
Okay, that's nice. I don't work that well with people that do, there's some things that I find boring that I just kind of can't get excited about or can't figure out why it's interesting, although I don't deny that it's interesting to other people. And there are some other things that I'm just super fascinated by that I'm probably know more than enough about it already. But, I think that designers who who come into those situations and they just can't wait to start doing design all over it. Right. And they're not patient, they're not really taking advantage of this chance to kind of crack open a door and to step into another world. A lot of times you end up running out of aspects of graphic design that are interesting. It's there are only so many typefaces and colors and shapes and whatnot, right? Right. And so a big source of inspiration for me is just whatever particular situation I'm thrown into.
What advice would you give to an entry-level designer when trying to land their first, real job and get their foot in the door in the big leagues, so to speak?
Okay, my first advice is, you should aim high, but kind of work, kind of work your strategy up from the bottom. That's what I would do. This is really specific advice. What I would do is, if you know anyone that has a job at a place that you think is interesting, if you know anyone that has a job, start with them. Someone who graduated last year from your school, someone who's graduated from your class from your school. They're sort of your first step into things. I think people just sort of get it in their heads that they're cheating themselves or they're not ambitious enough if they don't if they don't start with the list of AIJ medalists and work down from there. But that's not how I got the job with Massimo Vignelli. I got the job with Massimo Vignelli because I had an internship, and the guy that I worked with directly at that internship, not the boss, but the guy who was my direct supervisor, who had graduated from school himself maybe 3-4 years ago, had a classmate who had graduated with him 3-4 years ago and who had just gotten a job at Vignelli Associates in New York. And so I was going to New York, and this guy I worked for, Tom, said, hey, why don't you look up my friend Peter? If you're down in New York, he just got this job at Vignelli. And so that's how I got in there. And I wasn't even saying, can you introduce me to Massimo Vignelli, or I'm looking for a job. I just wanted to sort of like see what the inside of that office looked like. So I was kind of like going in without any particular agenda. Yeah. And I just loved, again, I loved doing that just because I loved kind of like seeing where people worked, and I just thought it was all fascinating. Right. And I never sort of like viewed, you know, any of those encounters or interviews as sort of like oh my God, this is like the big interview that's going to make or break my career. To me, it was just fun. It's like tourism for me, sort of. Yeah, you know? Yeah. I agree, and by the way, I was doing this at a moment in time in the early 80s where there was a terrible economic recession going on. You know, the economy was, you know, crummier, you know, as crummy as it's ever been. And the field itself was much, much smaller. I mean, you actually could get you could get the names of every single kind of decent graphic design company in New York typewritten on one side of a piece of paper, basically. Yeah. Yeah, it was a small field. And on top of that, it was completely baffling because, you know, there was no internet, obviously, so your ability to research any of these places was almost non-existent. You couldn't go online and see what kind of work they did at a place like Gosh, Chalk and Ash, let's say, you know. Yeah. And even I can't remember how I knew what I knew about Massimo Vignelli, going to school in Cincinnati, Ohio, without any internet, without anything else, right? Just was, you know, stuff in books and magazines, and there were darn few of those back then. So I think, you know, to me, I think it's a matter of just letting your enthusiasm and interest and curiosity be your guide. It works when you're, like I said, same advice I gave really for being a good designer. Right. I think the same thing somehow pertains when you're looking for a job. If you sort of like get fixated on one place and say that's the place I really want to work at, chances are it's not going to work out. It didn't work out for me. The place I really wanted to work at was Schermerhorf and Geismar, actually. That was my favorite design firm in New York. Nothing against Vignelli Associates, but it was Schermerhorf and Geismar where I really sort of like, they represented kind of like my idea of what design was all about. And I dropped off my portfolio. I picked it up. There was a nice note inside. But it was sort of like nice to see your portfolio. Go away, kid. You know. Yeah. Better luck next time.
It's nice just to get a response sometimes too.
Yeah, I know. Yeah. Meanwhile, my wife, who in the same period, my wife, who's not a designer, who had an MBA, was looking for a job, and she would just go to the post office with like literally 30 letters at a time, lick the stamps, drop them in the mailbox, wait for a response, and she'd maybe get 5 responses back. 4 of which were form letters saying we have no positions, but thanks for your interest, and then 1 of which might be something. And you know, I can't believe anyone got anything done in those days, licking stamps and waiting for a landline phone. It was amazing. So, in a way, Rob, you got your work cut out for you. There's like tons of places all over the country, all over the city, all over the world, for that matter, that are doing really interesting work where you could actually have a blast. And it's just a matter of you know, not holding your breath. You know, I just, to me, I would be like a kid in a candy store these days. There'd be so many places that I'd be interested in working, so many places I'd never heard of that I'd even be more excited about. And so I think there's tons of possibilities out there. I think if you just are open-minded and don't worry about kind of like, you know, that big interview with your, you know, with your design hero, that may not be the thing that opens the door.
That's happening now, so that's I could check that off the bucket list. So
yeah, but I mean, the people, I hear you. I have 8 designers that work for me, and every single one of them started at Pentagram as an intern, as a paid intern. Not always on my team. And they didn't. Some of them kind of went from being an intern on my team to being a full-time designer on my team. Right. And a lot of those interns are people who, I mean, I usually don't even hire the interns here. You know, my senior designers will do the interviews, look at the portfolios, and pick who's going to be here for 3 months or 6 months or whatever it is. And then sometimes some of those people click, and then they end up here full time, and they end up here for 5 years. And like, you know, and so I've got a fantastic team. And, you know, all of them have those characteristics that I described that I admire and I like to see in other people. but I don't think with any of them they ever had like sort of that moment of truth where it was an interview and it's between them and two other people and they had to kind of come in. It just was,
Yeah.
these things can happen in mysterious ways without you even noticing, actually.
Yeah, that's cool. And you definitely indeed have a very talented design team. Brett
Yeah.
Cobb and all those guys. Those guys are all design heroes of mine, I guess you could say.
Me too.
They're so the work that you guys do in the physical space is I love everything, but
Yeah.
I kind of had that same experience that you had with like the school play poster.
Mm-hmm.
I've had that that experience a couple times. Like on the last company that I worked for, it was in my town. There was a big sign right out. I had that kind of poster moment where there's an actual sign. So I can only imagine the opportunity to work at places like Governor's Island and things of that nature, and Verizon. I remember I walked into MetLife Stadium for a Jet game. I'm not a Jets fan, but I went with my uncle, and I remember seeing the Verizon logo that you had created, and I saw it, and there was a big media storm around that one too. And at first I wasn't like totally sold on it because it was just such a change, but I went to MetLife Stadium and I saw the Verizon logo in the physical form, in a physical sign, like in MetLife Stadium. And I was like, wow, Michael Bierut did it again. What a great logo. But it's just so cool. Like I could only imagine working, you're at the Jet game and all of a, you look off in the distance and there's your logo. Is that as awesome as I would think it is?
Awesome may not be the word, but it is funny. I mean, I'd say every time I ride a subway car in New York, chances are there's a Pentagram logo somewhere in the car, and sometimes it's one that I did, and it's fun actually. And one of the things, I mean, that experience you just described is part of what happened as I matured as a designer. And I think you can only achieve this through work and experience over time. I'm not sure there's a shortcut to it. Is the design that looks fantastic in a presentation, or the design that looks fantastic in your sketchbook, or the design that looks fantastic on your own computer screen, may not be the design that'll work the best at MetLife Stadium. And it's actually hard to imagine, these things having lives that go beyond, your own, coming out of your own head
to a global scale. Which
your
is
team's
really
head,
crazy.
going out there and kind of having a life, and a life, in fact, that that may go on for some time. And I think particularly with Verizon, which I would admit as much as anyone else is sort of like, it's not like a tricky logo. It's like straightforward and simple a thing as we could possibly make it. And our client was really enthusiastic about this drive towards simplicity. Mm-hmm. And one of the things that I wanted to do was come up with something that I thought people could have fun. People could do things with, a week after it's launched, a year after it's launched, 5 years after it's launched, 10 years. People could still be coming up with different kind of like twists that kind of simplicity would allow. And I studied logos like the Nike swoosh or the Target, and you sort of realize that those things are just they're not like, I mean, they're brilliant, simple, abstract forms, but they're not like,
Right.
I'm not sure you'd say like the Target logo is quote unquote creative. It's a dot with a circle around it, and it's illustrating the word that it stands for. But it's been used. That simplicity allowed it to be used in so many different interesting ways that that couldn't have been anticipated or preordained by the designers of it back in the late '60s. So I think it takes a certain amount. So you have to. I think some people freak out if the thing they designed goes out into the world and it's used in ways that they weren't imagining. Right. They want to sort of have it.
I've experienced that firsthand.
I mean, and I sort of the control freak in me obviously wants everything to be used a certain way, exactly the way I want it to be used. But what I've learned as I've kind of gone on in my career is that life is more complicated than that. Right. And sometimes the best thing you can do is come up with something that actually is is almost specifically designed to enable different people to do things to it, that has a kind of simplicity and basic integrity that'll allow those sort of variations to happen without really changing it fundamentally. And I've designed things that were so delicate and tricky that they almost needed to be like handled with white gloves and kind of, it has to be done exactly this way or it won't work. And those things, like they're fragile, and they end up kind of, you turn around and a year later or even a week later someone's doing something wrong with them, and you can't make a rule book, you can't inaugurate people as the logo enforcers to kind of keep everyone in line, because the nature of human life is there's going to be people are going to react with precision sometimes, or react sloppily other times, and that's just what life is. That's what makes life interesting.
Yeah, absolutely. And I had a great talk with this for anyone who's interested on this topic. My last podcast was with Leland Mashmeyer from Collins, who's just incredible. I've watched that time and time again, and I'm still trying to catch up with what he's saying. But they were talking about when they designed at Collins, and him and Brian do excellent work. But they were talking about how they make systems with the in-house designers in mind. So when all is said and done, and they're done consulting, that the designers want to then use that work and put that out into the world. And like the Spotify system was very fluid, and you had that with the Hillary campaign and all that stuff. So hope that logo works, man. That's all I gotta say. Get Trump out of there. Oh,
me too. Step by step.
Yep. Okay, so on the subject of logo design here, your podcast with Jessica Helfand, The Observatory. Jessica's watching. I'm a big fan of hers too. On a recent episode entitled The Good, the Flat, and the Ugly, very clever, by the way, you had a very nuanced conversation about the new Instagram logo. But I wanted to weigh in with a question about rebranding. When you see on the one hand, you see many brands, it almost seems as if they're like throwing the baby out with the bathwater, so to speak. Not really being cognizant of like brand equity or what that logo represents. They rebrand it, but not, the end user doesn't always want it to be rebranded. But on the other hand, though, it sparks a global, very powerful global conversation that, is heard throughout the world. I mean, I would venture to say that the guys over at Instagram, I mean, that campaign was a success. I think. I mean, so many people talked about it. Say what you will about it. It got a conversation. Everybody knows it. Whether or not you like it, it's out there. It's been discussed time and time again. But should there be concern in the design community about that, though? That this kind of, this year it's gradients, next year it's not gradients, and kind of just flip-flopping back and forth. I mean, I don't think that companies like Coca-Cola would have been so successful if they were constantly, rebranding these global icons.
Yeah. When someone approaches me to do something, and that something involves replacing something that's already there, a lot of times my first question to them will be, "Are you sure you want to change this thing?" I mean, if they're successful, I'll say, what is it about this thing that's contributed to your success? What is it about it that's, that you think is impeding even more success? I don't think change for change's sake is a really exciting or interesting brief to get. I think it's really interesting if that answer comes back and it's like, yeah, this thing is fine, except we really need to do this, that, and the other thing, and it's time. Now, sometimes they'll come to you and it's something that is just obviously not good, and it's in glaring need of improvement. But even in those cases, people who are used to the thing will sort of not be happy that it's changing. I think probably half the human population, and maybe even a lot more than that, are just people who are fundamentally predisposed to resist change. They're conservative. They put their toothpaste in the same place every night, and it's there when they wake up in the morning, and they're habituated to things. And I think logos, which are an odd cosmetic little thing and something that 20 years ago no normal person could have been expected to have an opinion on. Only trained professionals like you and me were thought, we were thought odd that we had opinions about these things, right? But now people, people have opinions for a number of reasons. One of them is that their relationship with something like the Instagram logo or icon is, that's really part of their life. If they're enthusiastic users of that platform, they are interacting with that symbol, dozens of times a day, hundreds of times a day. They think that it's theirs. It's part of their life,
Right.
And then suddenly you change it on them, and they feel like you're changing something that belongs to them, right? And people just don't like that. They don't like that if
which is valid, I think. I mean, I kind of get that.
It's legitimate, but on the other hand, and I think anyone who does, for instance, I know a lot of architects who do. I know a lot of architects, including a lot of architects who are involved with historic preservation and those kind of issues. And on one hand, it's a tragedy to knock down a beautiful old building. On the other hand, if we're not allowed to ever knock down any buildings to build newer buildings in their place, that more or less halts progress. Right. At a certain time, it means like, you're living in a museum, basically. Everything's like frozen in time. So there has to be this kind of push and pull between the comfort that tradition and equity and older things provide and the need for us to experience new things and progress. And just like, evolution in the animal kingdom, it's, sometimes that progress is steady. Sometimes there are weird kind of like, mutations that aren't fated to survive that long. But sometimes one of those mutations thrives and ends up setting a new standard for what things can look like. So I think that, I actually think that this conversation, this debate, even when it's at its most stupid, is healthy and sort of interesting. And moreover, I get the sense that clients out there are going to be increasingly disappointed if they put out a logo and no one they change their logo and no one comments on it. They'll sort of think, well, what did we do wrong? That was hardly worth the trouble. I think they deep down even rather provoke a Twitter storm of abuse that you can always survive and get through, that sort of nets out to sort of like more attention for you, your company, and the fact that you're a living, changing thing. Right. And then just sort of like someone that no one pays attention to, no one feels invested in, no one feels like they own. All these people are dying to have that level of identification with their companies, where consumers really think, oh, that's my company. I really identify with it. How dare you change the logo without asking my permission? I mean, who wouldn't want that?
It's my tribe.
Yeah, exactly.
In terms of these logos, though, do you think that designers, like I just watched the other day on the AIJ YouTube page, there's a great video. Forgive me for not remembering her name. Something Tao, I think. She's one of the creative directors over at Chipotle, and she was showing.
I know who you mean. Yeah.
She was just showing how just using a burrito, a silver foil burrito, and how much they were able to do with that. And I know you had mentioned, I think it was on Debbie Millman's interview. You had mentioned about how Chopped or whatever the thing was, working in the kitchen, it's like you can use anything. Or then you were saying about you can use a turn up, you can use 3 things, ready, go.
Yeah.
Do you think that a lot of people do these kind of rebrands as sort of like a cop-out, dare I say? Because on the one hand, you could look at it like sometimes it's needed, like in the case of Verizon, I think that it was needed, but I think there are other times that's like, well, we can't really make anything that would be like noteworthy. So let's just do something completely different.
Yeah, I mean, sometimes, like I said, it's unsatisfying to do this work when you feel you're just. It's the most satisfying to do when you think you're making some sort of change that's mirroring a real change of substance in the relationship the company or the institution has with the public, I think there's always a gap between the way people are and the way they're perceived. There's also a gap between the way they're perceived and the way they want to be perceived. Right. And there's also a gap between the way they are and the way they want to be, And I think you can't the way they are and the way they want to be. That's sort of up to them. But designers can play a role in how people are perceived, and sometimes that outward perception ends up being, it can reflect real change, or it can actually drive change. Like if at the end of The Wizard of Oz, Oz gives everyone, sort of gives the Cowardly Lion courage, gives the Tin Man a heart, gives the Scarecrow a brain. And he actually, what's really funny is, what's beautiful about that story and about the movie particularly is that throughout the entire movie, the Scarecrow's the smartest one. He always has the ideas.
Right.
The Tin Man is the one that's always motivated by sentimentality and emotion. And the Cowardly Lion is the one that at the moment of truth acts with real courage, right? So they all actually have those traits within them. They just are unaware of it, and they're longing to sort of have them expressed. So what they get are these outward manifestations, actually artifacts that are associated with those things. A diploma for the Scarecrow, for instance, and the ticking heart for the Tin Man. Those are logos, basically. That's like design. That's like
beautiful what you just said. That's awesome.
It's communication design, and what it does is not making them smarter or more, giving them more of a heart or more.
Because he didn't really have any power, right? I mean, that was kind of like
he didn't have any power, but he was a showman, and I think that designers are showmen. What we do is it has a rhetorical meaning, and I think if you're trying to make someone look smart and they're actually dumb, fake glasses with thick glasses with fake glass in them is
like man bun.
Yeah, is gonna you're still going to say as many dumb things as you're capable of saying.
Yep.
And you're not going to fool people for long. But I think to the degree that someone is smarter than they look, you can actually do a lot of things to make them look smart. And I think part of what design is all about is figuring out what those triggers are to help people align the way they think of themselves, the way they want to be perceived, the way the public perceives them, and kind of get those things all lined up a little bit more neatly in a way that benefits everyone.
That's so cool. That's definitely the on the best of clips right there. I'm gonna chop that right out. I think I would be remiss if not to ask this, because I feel in a way kind of like the luckiest guy in the world as a graphic designer, because in the coming weeks, probably the next 2 to 3 weeks, I will be going into a new job, and I'm pretty sure I'm the first person ever who's had the opportunity to sit down with you. For kind of a brief before my career. This video is going to be very weird to watch in the future. But I'm just curious, what have you learned along the way in terms of how to carry yourself, and what I understand that you've kind of had only worked at a few places, which is a little bit different than the path of most people. But if you had to give me any advice, things to avoid.
I mean, some of the things that were important to me were, and it took me a long time to learn all these things, but they were the keys for me, is one, that you don't learn by talking, you learn by listening. And if you like to talk, and you're smart and you're articulate, and you sort of sound that way to me, and I think of myself, I used to think I was super smart, super articulate, and but you don't actually, the part of a conversation you learn from is the part where the other person's talking, and if you're a designer and you sort of think you're selling stuff, you're selling yourself, you're selling your ideas, the way you think you have to sell it is just by getting out your fire hoses and then just turning them all the way up and just blasting the people you're pitching to into submission. And I can do that, and it just doesn't work. It really doesn't work. It's not a good way to be, and you don't learn anything from it, and it's just no fun. So there was a point along the way where I just sort of had this Zen kind of experience, and I realized I'm just going to relax and be in the moment and listen instead of talking all the time, and that actually was a big help to me. Another thing is to and then those other things that are kindergarten rules, work hard and be nice, and and actually and be be honest, admit when you're wrong. I've sort of I've had terrible disasters in my 9 to 5 life where I've committed, giant errors of judgment or carelessness that have really, made, were horrible things for which I could have been fired, or certainly could have been fired by my boss, or been dismissed by my client. And in every one of those cases, somewhere along the line, I don't know, I read this essay that had a huge effect on me in the New Yorker magazine that was written by a structural engineer, the guy that was a structural engineer of the City Court building here in New York. It's a fantastic essay called something like the 56-Story Crisis. And in my book, 79 short essays on design, I actually kind of like tell the same story that's in this essay from a design point of view. But basically what this guy had done was he was the structural engineer for the City Court building, which was a skyscraper built in Midtown Manhattan in the mid-'70s. Had this really unusual way of meeting the ground because its structural supports were centered on its 4 faces as opposed to at the corners. Right. So it'd be like a chair that had 4 legs, but the legs were straight in the middle, straight in the back, and straight on either side instead of at the 4 corners, right? And he did all these calculations as a structural engineer to determine that it would be safe to do it that way, and worked it all out. And then long after it was built and after it was occupied, he had cause to recalculate kind of the wind stresses coming from a particular direction, and realized that he had made a mistake, and that in fact the building was in danger of falling down. That could collapse if there was winds of a certain velocity coming from a certain direction. And he was completely freaked out by this. And this essay by, I think, a writer named Joe Morgenstern, it sort of describes the moment where he sort of realizes what he has to do. And what he does is he calls up the chairman of Citigroup and says, you've never met me, I'm your structural engineer, but I have something very important to tell you. Then he just confesses the whole thing and says, I'll do whatever it takes to make this right. And this is a guy who basically is at a moment in time where his career is effectively over. He's liable to be sued for every penny he has, and every penny that professional liability insurance can provide. And, it's just his life is effectively over. And instead of lying or killing himself or doing a lot of other shit that people would try to do, right, pass the buck, you see what politicians do day in and day out when they're faced with that sort of choice. He simply said, I was wrong. Tell me what I have to do to fix this, or let's work together to fix this. And, today he's, I think he's still alive, but he lived the rest of his career as a professional structural engineer. Awesome. Was a respected professor of engineering. Ended up continuing on with his practice. Actually emerged with more respect because of this than he would have had otherwise. So there's 2 things you can learn from this story. One is that like, if you make a mistake, just take comfort in the fact that it's not going to kill anyone. If you're a structural engineer, you can make big mistakes that really can't have influence on human safety. Right. If you're a graphic designer, chances are it's just going to be embarrassing. So your biggest mistake is not that big. But secondly, if you just kind of take responsibility for your failures as well as your successes, and learn from both and approach both with an open mind. I mean, just a couple of weeks ago, we made a big mistake for one of our clients, and I just said, "Sorry, this is all our fault. I feel really bad. You guys have been nothing. You guys have done all the right thing, and we let you down. So tell me what I have to do to make this right, and whatever you say goes." And I was amazed at how generous and professional and hardening the response is when you do that. And I just don't think, I think for one thing, it takes people by surprise because people don't do it that much anymore, so they're thrown off. Right. But I also think it just acknowledges that, again, what we do as communicators is about people dealing with each other with kind of honesty and openness. And if you do that professionally in your business life as well as in terms of what you're putting out there in the world, it'll work for you and it'll work for everyone.
Cool. That's so awesome. And I agree wholeheartedly. And that's so awesome. I think that transparency is key. And I'm very fortunate to be engaged to an amazing girl, my fiance, Sammy. And it's very similar to you. The first girl I met, I was like, this is it. Let's ride this out.
Yeah, good for you.
Yeah. And
I hope you have the same luck.
Yes, I do. And the transparency is key. When people ask, like, you guys seem so happy, why are you so happy? I say transparency and just honesty. And I feel very fortunate to have learned that lesson early. So, Michael, thank you so much for coming on today. This
Rob,
has been
thank you. It's a
awesome.
pleasure talking. Pleasure. Thank you.